The program is Monday through Friday, live 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Standard Time on 10 live streams. And of course, if you're listening on iTunes and all of the subscribing podcasts, we're not live, but you can check out the program either live or archived. And let's see. My guest is Rebecca Ost. She is the Director of Research at the Center for Family and Human Rights. Rebecca, your organization monitors the culture and the morality of our government, and you make the note here that the administration of Joe Biden has really eroded family values and family rights to an unprecedented degree historically. Before we go there, I want to ask you about the pro-life rally in Washington over the weekend. Were you involved with that, and how did that go?
I was not personally there. I was getting over a little illness, actually, but it was very well attended from everything I saw. Some of my colleagues were there. Despite the cold temperatures, the sub-zero temperatures in DC every year, rain or shine, snow or anything else, there's always a huge turnout. And of course, the atmosphere this year is particularly hopeful given the pending Supreme Court decision.
Indeed. And I think that, by the way, this is a rally that's been held every year. I think going back to Reagan, and it's huge and it gets very little media coverage. However, I believe that President Trump was the first sitting president to attend the rally and to endorse it very publicly. And that, yes, there is a Supreme Court case pending. It is the Texas case.
I think it's the Mississippi case, actually.
Okay, I think
Dobbs.
the Texas case is there as well, but it's the Mississippi case particularly. Now, my understanding is basically that Mississippi, it's the heartbeat law, which says that if there's a heartbeat after, I think it's 6 to 8 weeks into the pregnancy, then the state has a right to regulate the whether or not the unborn child is aborted. And I believe that actually is completely consistent with Roe versus Wade, which basically views the pregnancy in 3 different trimesters, and that the second trimester, which is 3 months in, the state does have the right to regulate abortion, and it absolutely has a right to ban abortion in the 3rd trimester unless there's an extremely rare circumstance where a woman is going to die unless she has an abortion. Am I right about that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand, the state has an interest, I guess, in the life of the unborn child starting in the 3rd trimester, like you said. In the 2nd trimester, I think the standard was that you're not allowed to put, an undue burden on women seeking an abortion. So you can place restrictions around it that don't constitute an undue burden. And so heartbeat type bans have been considered an undue burden in the past in light of Roe, which is why the Mississippi, the argument being made is that they have to overturn Roe because, this is basically because it's pre-viability. I think viability is the point at which they say the state has an interest. And of course, we know that since 1973, where you can establish fetal viability is a moving target, right? We see more and more premature babies who are surviving and thriving than certainly back then. So the question is that even like a workable, legal benchmark?
Well, these things, of course, have been reinterpreted by the hard left, by the pro-choice movement, including the idea that the life of the mother does no longer means if a mother is going to die as a result of having a pregnancy. It means if a pregnancy is inconvenient.
Well, the health exception has become the exception you can drive a truck through, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well.
Now, I would suggest that from what I've observed in terms of this rally, there were a lot of younger people there, a lot of women were there. There's a growing movement of awareness among younger people, and that has to do almost as much with science as it does with moral questions. which of course are profound. You know, the killing of an unborn child is something that's abhorrent, whether you favor legal abortion or not. I think even the most hard left people will at least say that publicly. But putting that aside, the science, I think, has evolved to the point where you can see the pregnancy more vividly, and there's more known about the unborn child, and that the unborn child has feelings and that experiences pain, and there's films of this. And I think that the whole business of ultrasound has raised awareness from a scientific standpoint, and that from a science standpoint, abortion has become much less popular and much more rejected by people because of the science of, you know, the unborn child and the examination of it. And I think it's particularly odious that Planned Parenthood, apparently, when a woman has an ultrasound, they will face the camera away so she doesn't see it, in case she might get attached to her baby. You know, can you imagine that? So that way they can look at it separately and maybe do some strategies. And I don't want to get into this because I'm running the show on YouTube, so I want to be careful here. But let's just say that there's a business going on there that's been exposed in terms of what happens to the unborn child once it's yanked out of the womb. All right, we'll leave it at that. So Rebecca, your organization is monitoring the Biden administration, and you note that on issues of family values, they have been more radical than any previous administration. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So just a little bit of background on my organization. We actually focus on the international context, specifically international institutions like the United Nations, and what the US is doing relative to these international institutions. And in particular, we track issues of human life and the family, you know, as they pertain to the UN. And so we've been working there for over 20 years now, you know, basically reporting on what's going on at the UN and how increasingly radical the UN and its agencies have become, but also looking at how the US as a global leader is using that leadership and its influence, you know, as one of the major donors of not just bilateral aid, but also the UN system.
So they're looking to this international body of bureaucrats outside of the United States for guidance in terms of how the American family should live and how we should conduct ourselves. I want to ask you, this is just a thought that I have and have had about the UN. Would it be possible for an organization like yours or another pro-life organization or family values organization to actually form an NGO and have that recognized as a member of the UN? It seems to me that if that could happen, then you could have someone in the room over there, you know, somebody like as a delegate attending their various international conferences and keeping tabs on it, voting, you know, reporting on it. Is there any NGO like that that's part of the UN system?
Well, that almost, I mean, apart from actually having a vote like member states, like countries do, that pretty much describes what we do. We are accredited with the UN, with the Economic and Social Council, yes, as a civil society organization, as are other pro-life and pro-family groups. I mean,
okay, good.
So basically we do interact with the UN, we do attend meetings, we do have interactions with various delegates from countries that have like-minded positions on family issues. So that is pretty much precisely what we are there to do, you know, both to report on what's going on, but also to influence and be part of that discussion. So, so that is, yes. And we would encourage more people in the US to take an interest because there's a lot going on there. And we might think it doesn't affect us directly, but, you know, in many ways, what originates abroad does come back here, you know, and one of the things on the pro-life side is this whole idea of do-it-yourself mail order abortion. This is something that has been really promoted heavily in countries with restrictive laws, particularly in Latin America. The idea that you can just, you know, order the pills from some supplier in the black market and do abortions at home on your own. And of course, we know that this is increasingly coming here, especially as the, you know, the prospect of Roe being overturned looms large.
Right. So in other words, what, like the morning after pill kind of thing, or is it?
Not the morning after pill. No, there's two drugs called misoprostol and mifepristone that, the combined is what we might know as RU486 or the abortion pill, which basically, causes the death and, basically a miscarriage in the woman.
Okay, now there was, I believe, a Supreme Court victory a few years back around the Hobby Lobby, which said that they do not want to fund or finance the issuance of these what they call abortifacients. Same thing with the Catholic Church. It ran against their moral standards, and I think that has been upheld by the Supreme Court.
Yes, there's a slight distinction there, just that there are contraceptive methods that could be abortifacient. That is to say that if you were pregnant and you used this method, it could possibly, for example, prevent the implantation of an embryo, right? So you have a human embryo, it's already a human life, but it would make the mother's uterus inhospitable for that to attach, which would cause the death of. So this is a case where when we're talking about abortion causing drugs, we're not talking about something that a person's trying to use as a contraceptive that could have an abortion effect. We're talking about something that is used specifically to induce an abortion once the woman knows she's pregnant.
Now, I'm sorry to be a bit ignorant on the science of this. I don't claim, I certainly am, but I mean, is that something that can be done in more advanced stages of a pregnancy? I mean, isn't that something that has to be done, God forbid, like in the first very earliest weeks of a pregnancy?
Well, let's just say that the risks to the woman go up considerably the more advanced the pregnancy is. So, in the first trimester, the risk is less than in the second, and, certainly in the third. And that's true of all abortion methods too, that the more advanced the pregnancy is, the more dangerous to the mother it is. So that certainly is true. Yes.
Okay. So then basically what it is killing the fetus with chemicals.
Correct.
Probably not very healthy for the mother either, quite frankly.
No.
Not to mention the fact that I think there have been some studies, and I want to be careful here because I'm running YouTube today, that indicate that there might be a connection between abortion and such things as breast cancer and other ailments. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not commenting on that, but it does seem to me, just as somebody who's observing, that it would make sense that it would be connected. Because I mean, if when a woman is pregnant, your entire body, your entire chemical, everything changes to be oriented toward carrying the baby. And when you cut that off, artificially, that it seems to me it's only logical that would have a pretty serious effect physically, not to mention psychologically and emotionally, on a woman. So I just think we should say that.
Absolutely.
Now, you are mentioning that the Biden administration has rescinded the Mexico City policy, which is where taxpayer dollars once again are now going toward funding international groups that promote abortion. Now, this Mexico City policy seems to be re-implemented and suspended depending upon which administration's in power. The Bush administration suspended it and ended it. The Obama administration brought it back. The Trump administration
the other way around.
Really? Oh, so how does it work?
So the Mexico City policy is named after a conference that was held in the 1980s in Mexico City, where Ronald Reagan actually announced the first iteration of this policy. Mm-hmm. Now, you have to know that US law already prohibits the direct funding of abortion overseas. It's right. a law called the Helms Amendment to the International Foreign Assistance Law. So that basically, so there is no taxpayer funding going toward abortion directly or for promoting it directly ever since 1973, the same year that Roe was passed. And that law has remained in effect no matter who's president. Now, the Mexico City policy is an executive order that Ronald Reagan was the first to implement. And it basically says, if you are an organization that promotes or provides abortion, even with separate funding, mm-hmm. Planned Parenthood, for example, working abroad, they can't use US dollars for that, but, money is fungible, right? You just move it around.
Right. Well,
so what Reagan says was, if you are one of the groups that does the bad thing, you are ineligible for that reason to receive US funding. Now you have to, it only applies to foreign-based NGOs, so like, international Planned Parenthood affiliates. But the idea is that, nobody who does this terrible thing should be eligible for US aid. And so it's a very effective policy. Of course, it is just an executive order. So when, Clinton and Obama and, other, and certainly Biden come into office, the first thing they do pretty much is to rescind it. And it should be noted, too, that under Donald Trump, he not only reinstated the policy after Obama, but he also expanded it. The policy used to only apply to the family planning budget, but now it applies to all of global health in USAID. So, and of course, we know that the abortion issue has kind of metastasized all over, the health agenda. And so it makes sense that the policy would have to be expanded to sort of capture all of that. But of course, one of the first executive orders of Biden was to rescind that policy.
Right. And I think that I understand that the USAID and International Planned Parenthood began receiving enormous amounts of federal money starting in the 1960s, actually with Lyndon Johnson. And a lot of it went toward what population control in India. There were experiments done there where women were sterilized without their knowledge. I mean, horrible, inhuman things. In Peru and in South America, this kind of policy happened. In the Philippines, it happened. And that, the American people, and I would suggest, regardless of where you fall on the issue of abortion, there is nothing either in the Constitution or in Roe versus Wade that says that the American taxpayer has to have their money taken out of their pocket to pay for abortion. And given the fact that roughly 50% of the American people from the time of Roe versus Wade right up till today oppose abortion, the government should not be funding abortion at all in the world because Americans don't really support it. It's not, there's no, this isn't like, funding our military or funding welfare programs. This is funding an activity that the American people, about 50% of, reject. So I just don't understand how it is that you could have a government saying, okay, well, we're going to go ahead anyway and do this.
Well, again, thankfully the Helms Amendment still exists, so we're not directly funding abortion even now. Of course, the Biden administration has expressed a desire to repeal, the Helms Amendment, which of course they can't do without support from Congress. But, and they've also expressed a desire to have congressional action block permanently the Mexico City policy from going back into effect. But thankfully, the Republicans still have something of a stronghold in Congress and, hopefully a good midterm coming up. So hopefully these things will never see the light of day. But it's still important to know that the Biden administration has publicly expressed its support for that, as well as expressing support for, in particular, one piece of legislation that declares abortion to be an international human right, which is not the case, but that's the position of the Biden administration, which, just goes to show how extreme they are.
This is an imperialist imposition on nations that are not interested in having abortion policy. This is, Muslim nations, for example, generally are anti-abortion. Asian nations are anti-abortion, African nations, traditional societies. What right does the United States have to march in and declare, to a sovereign nation that they have to have abortion policy and to engage in that kind of pressure? That is up to the nation. That's up to the people that live in a nation. Look, if they want to have abortion, they can decide that internally, just like we decided internally. I would suggest that in America, given our constitutional system, it ought to be decided by the states. And that, of course, is exactly what will happen if Roe versus Wade is rescinded. States who want it will have it, and states that don't won't. In my own state of Massachusetts, for some reason, which I don't understand, it's very, very strange. A couple of years ago, they actually expanded abortion to include, the baby the minute it's born. Right up to the point of birth. Even in some cases after the baby is born. I don't understand why in our state suddenly they needed to do this. Is it all of a sudden this great need to have that done? It's really baffling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I live in Virginia. As you may recall, our former governor made some comments to that effect as well.
Let me just touch on that a little bit. Northam was giving an interview to NPR, two very liberal hosts, where he stated that as a pediatrician, he had performed what I would suggest can only be described as murder by a botched abortion where the baby was born. And he said that he put the baby in a comfortable place to let the baby die after about a half an hour. And the two women who were conducting this interview, both of whom were very liberal and very pro-choice, they were shocked. They were stunned. It's like, this is, it's simply something that, I mean, in a way, I mean, look, most Americans kind of fall in the middle on this issue. They despise abortion, but they understand that it needs to be legal in many cases, at least in the early stages. But this kind of radical thing going on there, I mean, I think that that's rejected by just about everyone except some kind of hardcore, population control, satanic, frankly, left wing.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
I get to shoot my mouth off. It's my show, right?
Yes.
I hope that YouTube takes that into account. I mean, I generally don't run the show live on YouTube anymore. I wrote the main station now is Rumble. And by the way, you can check out my website at charlesmoscowitz.com. So Biden immediately rescinded the Mexico City policy. He publicly supports the withdrawal of the Helms Amendment, as you say, which limits the U.S. use of foreign assistance to promote abortion, and which has been in existence since 1973. The Biden administration is moving to decriminalize prostitution and has been trying to portray it in the same as any other type of business by labeling it, quote, sex work. Now, look, I mean, questions of prostitution in the American system have generally been regulated by the states, not the federal government. I mean, I don't think prostitution should be legal, but at the same time, the state of Nevada has legal prostitution. They heavily regulate it. They require that people go and get checked very frequently for STDs. And, it's kind of like there's a lot of state oversight. And while I may personally not think it's a great idea, I respect the right of the state of Nevada to do that. But what Obama, what the Biden or whoever's controlling this administration is talking about is a nationalization of legalizing prostitution.
Well, just to be very clear, my work and my organization's work focuses on the international rather than the domestic. And so what we're getting at here is the Biden administration using and supporting the use of the phrase sex work in place of referring to prostitution in international situations. And of course, different countries have different laws. Some countries have completely decriminalized it. Some have legalized it, but regulated it, the Netherlands being one example of that. But just the shift in language, signals this support for this international movement toward decriminalization, because basically what this movement is trying to do is just equate it to any other kind of work. So,
sure. I mean, they're basically trying to normalize it and trying to say, well, this is just, like being a dentist, you're putting up a shame, except it's for prostitution. You're selling your body, as if there's no moral component to it. And by the way, again, I want to be careful here, but I believe that I have information indicating that the same thing is happening with pedophilia. There was a conference in Montreal a couple of years ago where the sexologists got together and they talked about pedophilia being called a, quote, orientation, unquote, rather than a perversion. And by doing that, they're saying, well, I mean, somebody who's engaging in it, they can't help it because it's their orientation, as opposed to creating a moral judgment on it, which of course we do. But I think that, quite frankly, and again, I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube here, but I think that, frankly, this is something that is coming down the pike in the next maybe 3 to 5 years even.
Well, it tells you that language matters. I mean, I can understand the distinction that some are trying to draw between people who might be inclined toward abusing children and those who actually do.
Mhm.
and wanting to try and steer people away from that who might have that inclination, as opposed to assuming that they all offend. That is a distinction I understand. But when it comes to the sex work prostitution distinction, I think what gets lost in that is, the fact that a lot of people engaged in that line of work are not there because they want to be. There's a lot of people who are trafficked into it.
That's right.
And, I mean,
Yeah.
to change the language, basically, I mean, it's a little bit as though, if people who want to weigh in on, exploitative labor practices in the agricultural, realm, if hobbyist gardeners wanted to dominate the conversation, those who do it because they want to on their own time, as opposed to those who are being trafficked, or being underpaid. So it's, it's one of those kind of situations where what's getting lost in the shuffle is all the people who are unwillingly, involved in that kind of
No,
exploitation.
I think you're right. There's a whole issue of sex trafficking, a subject I can't talk about on YouTube. For some reason, people in YouTube are sensitive about this. I don't
I'm
know.
sorry. I hope I'm not getting you
No,
kicked
no,
off.
no. I think we don't say more about it. I've had videos pulled down because I've interviewed people about sex trafficking. I guess that's a no-no for YouTube. I'm not saying they support it, but apparently they don't like to have these horrendous, evil crimes investigated, and this phenomena investigated. So I'll leave it at that. Now, 10 million has been allocated to the Global Equity Fund, which gives the US government authority to blacklist foreign religious leaders who speak in favor of traditional family and against homosexuality or gender ideology. Now, what's this about? Are they giving money to blackmail foreign leaders and to demonize them if they support traditional values? And this is taxpayer money?
Well, so there's a couple of different things. One, I mean, the Global Equality Fund, the US is really throwing its weight behind promoting, the LGBTQ movement overseas, as
Okay.
well as here at home, as you know. And one part of what the administration is trying to do is to put a lot of pressure on those, in foreign countries who speak out against it, often on religious grounds. So coming up with ways of sanctioning them. There's actually some legislation pending in Congress right now, something called the Global Respect Act, that would basically create a blacklist if it were passed, and puts, sanctions. So basically deny people who are on that list visas to travel to the US, whether to move or to speak at conferences or whatever, and also to deny them access to, global financial, institutions that are involved with the U.S. So really to lay down the law. And of course, we have existing measures in U.S. law right now. There's something called the Global Magnitsky Act, which is, there for the purpose of sanctioning human rights abusers
Right.
overseas, people who are not US citizens, but who nevertheless we have the ability to inflict some pain on through, withholding visas and withholding access to financial markets. And so the idea is to create a Magnitsky Act effectively for LGBTQ people abroad. The problem is there already is one. It's called the Magnitsky Act, and it has been used to sanction people who have, committed crimes against people who identify as LGBTQ. And so it's on that level, it would basically just be a duplication. But the difference is that this would basically shift the focus really of the action from identifying legitimate crimes against humanity and punishing them accordingly, and rather to, interfacing with, activist groups abroad and making all people, who identify as LGBTQ, framing them as potential targets of hate crimes and trying to flush out, instances of that and then inflict penalties that way. And so there's, groups like my own would obviously land on such a list because we,
Right. And again, it has more to do with demonizing opinion and I
right. And
think that-
preachers who preach, a biblical worldview and so on and so forth could very easily find themselves in the crosshairs. So that's, some of the dangers on religious liberty and free
there are
speech.
dangers in this country because I mean, even in Canada, there have been preachers who have been imprisoned
Oh,
for
absolutely. And in Scandinavia,
reading
yes, there's,
quotes out of the Bible. There's also right now in Congress a bill that wants to create a database for people who object to the vaccine. Now, again, we can't talk about that, but let's just say that they're building a database of people who object on religious grounds. which is like building up a religious. I mean, why not? Why not? I mean, it reminds me, speaking here as a Jew, of like a list of Jews in Nazi Germany. They're building a list. I mean, to me, it's absolutely, it's despicable. It is wrong for the government to make any kind of list like that. They shouldn't, they're putting together credit scores for businesses, corporations that are not, if they don't score well in various areas, including quote unquote social justice.
Well, it's like the Chinese social credit scores, right?
Precisely.
I mean, this is where we're headed.
Precisely. And the US government has no business creating any lists of corporations or people other than if they're breaking the law and if they're involved with criminal activities. Maybe I would stretch that to say antitrust areas, but beyond that, they don't have any business creating these databases. Private companies do, nonprofits do, corporations do. I mean, I interviewed someone who has a database examining the anti-Christian content in movies, and they rate them. That's fine.
But that's movies. That's not, private citizens.
Well, but even, they can, in other words, you can do this in the private sector, but the government has no business doing this. It is very troubling to me, regardless of what they may say in terms of their intent, for them to be examining the opinions of private citizens, period. There's just no place for that in this country. So, Center for Family and Human Rights, Rebecca, talk a little bit about what you guys, I mean, the general good news is that there is going to be a Supreme Court decision coming up sometime between now and the end of the year, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the term, ends, I think, in June, and usually the biggest decisions, at least historically, come out then. I mean, obviously they could release a decision any day, but that seems unlikely. So, of course, June, July is where everyone's going to be watching.
And I just think that your group is doing a very good job of showing the sort of the intersection between the national policy and the international apparatus of the UN and how they are pushing, or they're deriving their guidance from these bureaucrats who are not American, usually, even if they are. They're not elected, they're not accountable, and they're faceless. And they are making decisions that affect the lives and the values of American families and American people. And it's wrong. So, Rebecca, where can people get information about your excellent group?
So our website is www.c-fam, as in family.org. I would encourage any of your listeners who are interested to sign up for our Friday Facts, which is a weekly newsletter. We publish 2 stories every week, so you can stay up to date with what's going on in life and family in the international context. And of course, if you want to support our work, you can do so through our website as well.
Which is?
www.c-fam.org.
Just want to make sure it's out there. Okay, Rebecca Oss, I want to thank you very much for joining me this evening. Very important conversation. Please stay in touch. I want to cover issues as they develop. So thank you very much, Rebecca.
Absolutely, Charles. It's